So Sunday we were talking about sin, and sin is one of those things where people often come to me and they say, Jeremy, why don't you talk more about sin? And I'm always caught off guard by that. I think I talk about sin all the time. I'm a pastor. That's part of what I do. So I want to talk about two things today related to sin and how we talk about them specifically here at Commons. So first of all, I'm always intrigued by the fact that those who tend to talk about sin the most, who use that language most frequently, tend to have the most impoverished imagination of what sin is. They speak about sin, they name sin, but when they do that, what they do is they often point to individual, personal, conscious choices, as if this was the extent of our sin. Now, that's not to say it's not. Of course, we all do sin, and we all do that personally and consciously, intentionally. But to imagine that that is the only way that sin has crept its way into the human experience, the only way that sin has corrupted our experience of the world and what it means to be human is, I think, needlessly naive. It's also not particularly biblical, because the scriptures speak about sin in all kinds of different ways. The Hebrew scriptures speak frequently about the sins of nations and groups of people. Paul speaks about principalities and powers. The book of Revelation is all about the ways that our systems and structures of sin impose themselves on the world, strip us of our imagination for a better world, and implicate us in the evil they enact on the world. In fact, even Jesus, when he's speaking in Matthew 25 about the sheep and the goats, says that at the end all of the nations will be gathered and he will separate them one from another. Some translations will say he will separate the people one from another, but that's not actually what's there in the Greek. It says the nations will be gathered and he will separate them one from another based on how they treated the least among them. So nations, groups, peoples, systems, structures, all of this is part of the way that sin infiltrates our world and damages the shalom, the peace of God. In fact, the individual wrong choices, the sin that I can enact in the world as an individual, pales in comparison to the ways that I participate in, I perpetuate the systems that oppress people and damage God's creation. So, first of all, to think about sin in very narrow, individualistic terms, it's not that that's not sin, it's just a very naive, very narrow, very impoverished way to think about sin. And when we pull back the curtain a little bit, we begin to understand that we participate in systems like white supremacy, or systems like racism, or systems that are economic and keep other people down on the economic ladder, systems that don't give the types of opportunities to everyone equally, systems that keep others pushed aside and at bay from us. We really are enacting a lot of damage in the world. And so it's really important that our imagination of sin back up. And so we're talking about sin all of the time at Commons. We might not be using the language that we're familiar with, but that's because when we use our most familiar language, the message has a tougher time getting through our defenses. So coming at things on the slant, coming at them from the sly in a new angle, actually helps us to understand sin more deeply. But the second thing that's important when we talk about sin is the ways that we confuse our symptoms and our root causes. Often what people will do is they point to things that look like sin and they put them on sin lists. Things like being selfish or greedy or standoffish or violent. Things like looking at pornography. All of these lists of things that we know we should not do and we back away from. And all of those are true. They are sin in a sense. They are not good for us. They're not the way that we were designed and intended to live our lives. But the truth is, they're not sin as much as they are symptoms of something broken, something twisted inside of us. And that thing is not knowing ourselves the way that God knows us. And we don't know ourselves as truly loved and accepted, welcomed and embraced. What happens is we begin to think of ourselves through a twisted lens. You imagine that we are on our own, and if I'm on my own and no one's going to look out for me, if I have to look out for number one always, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to be greedy. I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to gather everything that I can to myself. After all, if I don't look out for me, no one else is going to. If I'm not fully loved, I don't want to be open, vulnerable, and intimate with someone else. I just want to meet my needs as easily and with as little vulnerability as possible. And so maybe I resort to websites or pornography instead of pursuing actual deep, intimate relationships with other human beings. If I believe that the universe is cold and dark and there is no such thing as love at the center of it all, then of course I want to know who's my in-group. Of course I want to know who's my enemy. And of course I'm willing to push people away, even use violence to protect myself and my loved ones. All of these things that we name and we call a sin, they are certainly broken. They are certainly twisted expressions of the human experience, but they come out of not knowing ourselves the way that God knows us. When we know ourselves the way that Jesus tells us we are known, as loved and accepted, as welcome to God's table, what happens is we actually begin to need sin less. If I believe that God cares for me, that God will look out for me, not in the sense that God is going to make me rich, but that I'm not on my own, then I don't have this same drive to be selfish, to acquire more and more to myself. If I believe that everyone is the good creation of God, everyone is loved by the divine, then I begin to see them differently and welcome them into my space. When I believe that I am fully valued and loved, I realize that vulnerability, intimacy is not something to be scared of. It is something to be embraced. And even when I'm hurt, even when I'm rejected, that is only ever an expression of someone else's inability to recognize my value, never an expression of my inherent lack of love and acceptance in God. All of these things that we point to as sin, that we get caught up on, that we want to name and call each other out on, all they do is contribute to more shame, more guilt, less knowing ourselves as loved and beloved. And what that does is it drives us into those actions even more. And when we speak love to each other, when we remind us who we were meant to be, when we tell each other that God loves us deeply and accepts us who we are, then slowly all of these actions begin to become less important. We slowly begin to lose our need for them, and we slowly become sanctified. Because this is the gospel story. We are saved by grace, and we are transformed by grace. But then we expand our imagination. It doesn't just stick on the symptoms of sin that pop up in our individual lives. We begin to recognize the systems, the structures, the ways that we participate in a world that is full of brokenness and sin. And we begin to work for change. We push for justice. We call for righteousness. We march, we email, we call. We use our resources and our finances, our choice and our voice to speak for more justice and righteousness in the world. Because this is what it really means to understand sin. It's not to stay away from certain things. It is to lean into everything that God has for us and everything that God has for God's world. So please be aware of sin in the world. Be aware of the ways that it sucks you in and pulls you into all kinds of choices and systems that you do not want, you do not need to participate in. But don't beat yourself up or don't go through life thinking that if you just name sin, if you guilt yourself and shame yourself, you will somehow become the person you were meant to be. Know yourself as loved. Know yourself as welcome. Know yourself as the person God created you to be. One who can make better choices, one who can act for justice and righteousness, one who can contribute to a kingdom and a commonwealth of God that is in heaven right now and is being called into the earth slowly, step by all of us who follow the way of Jesus.